Hello again, friends. We're at it again. Still working on this apron. Now I'm taking my time to do this apron so that I can walk you through instructions that you may not understand. So now we're up to our little over apron. This sits on top of this bigger piece here. We're working on this apron, and this is where we need to attach our pockets. So if you look at the pattern piece, it looks like it's cut in half, isn't it? Well, no, we cut our material on the fold. I mean, this lines up with a fold, and then when we took our pattern piece off, voila, we've got a full-size piece. We didn't want a seam down the very center. If you notice also on the pattern piece, there are some little dots, and it gives you the sizes 7, 8, 5, 6, 3, 4. That is where you're supposed to line up your pockets. So if we lay this back onto our pattern, if we lay this back on our material, we're going to see where we want to attach our pockets. Remember last time how we made our pockets and shaped them? That's so we can lay them on this top apron. And we know I'm making the size 7, 8. 7, 8 here and 7, 8 here. So that we know this tip of the pocket is supposed to go right in the center of that bubble or that circle, and the outer side will fit approximately in that spot. You can just lay it right there so you know you're right in between those two bubbles. 7, 8, 7, 8. And what I'm going to do then is top stitch this pocket to my piece of apron material. A good way to hold your place is to either put a pin in each of those spots or mark it with a erasable marker, or transfer a dot with a transferable pen. You can buy them at the sewing store, of course. You want to get the kind that once you wash it, that pen mark comes off your fabric. You wouldn't want it to stay. But for the sake of time, I'm just going to pin. I'm just going to hold it down, line up my pattern piece really well, again, where it's supposed to go with my fabric. Find my bubble, lay it right there across my bubble, and then I'm just going to pull my pattern piece back and just put a little pin mark there, just so I know where I want to lay my pocket. And I'll do it the same on the other side. Over here. Find my bubble, pull it back, and then just put a pin right there. Of course, you want to do that on both sides. You would then take this pattern off and flip it to the other side of your fabric. And mark the same sides over here. You just flip it over and then put that pocket there. So let's go back to our first pocket, where we're going to lay our first pocket. I can see I have now a white pin and a green pin right in here, and I push that pin way in so these little pin heads would fit where those bubbles were. Now I know where to put this pocket. I have not removed my basting stitch yet, if you'll notice. I'm going to keep that in place until after we've sewn it down, because after all, that's what keeps this nice curve in our pocket. So I'm going to find the pin, and I'm going to lay the tip right on the pin, and now that's when I can pull out that pin and use it just to lay down my pocket. If you want to top stitch this pocket, you can. You can put a stitch right here. Before you put it anywhere near your apron, you could just run a top stitch right across here. It might look a little nicer, might keep a little longer. That's up to you. I'm going to find my other needle head. My other needle head is right here, okay? I'm just going to hold it in place, take that needle out, and just put it where my pocket is now, catching all the material. You want to catch your pocket and your underneath material. You want it to stay. I would then go around and put in pins all around this edge to keep that in place too. Okay, I have my pocket pinned in place. Now, before you do that, if you want to, like I said, do a top stitch, which means you're just basically taking your machine and you're sewing a stitch all the way across, and that's to hold that top piece over if you like that. Or you may want to add some lace right in through there, or a little rick-rack, which is a form of squiggly fabric. Let's see if I have some here. This blue is rick-rack, and you can buy it already made like that. See how they put the yellow on top of their pockets? You would do that to your pocket before you even attached it or pinned it to your apron. But I've decided not to add anything there, and we're just going to sew the pocket on now. I'm going to top stitch it on. Once again, what is a top stitch? Top stitch is I'm going to sew on top of everything, and it will attach to the underneath side. I wanted to show you the sewing needle again. If I can, whoop, that's a real close-up, isn't it? The sewing needle that goes into the machine has a curved side and a flat side. The flat side goes to the back of the machine, and the curved side fits in the front. So when you put it up into that needle shaft, that's the way you're going to put it up. You're going to put the curved side towards you and the flat side in the opposite direction of where you are sitting. And then it'll fit right up in there. You'll be able to know whether you put it in right or not because it won't fit any other way. So I'm going to put the needle in my machine, and we're going to sew our pocket. Okay, we're all threaded up, and now we're ready to sew. I like to fit this side of my presser foot, line that up directly with the edge of my pocket. Now if you notice, my pocket is way behind the needle back here. I don't want to start it right at the needle. I need to bring it behind the needle some, so that I can get a good start on my stitch. I want to be able to lock stitch it as well. And when you start off the fabric like that, whoops, sorry, you may move the camera. When you start it off the fabric and then try to get onto a more thickness of fabric, sometimes it just eats up your fabric and it doesn't look nice. So we're going to start off of it, and I'm going to start slow. I'm going to use my hand wheel to get me started. Okay, hopefully you don't bounce around too much. It might make you seasick, right? Okay, I've got my needle down, and I'm just going to go slowly with my presser foot, and I'm going to use the edge of my pocket material as my guide on where to put my presser foot. I did a couple stitches forward. Now I'm going to press and go backwards. Press my backwards button. Each machine is a little different. And I will just slightly go off the pocket fabric now. If you notice, if you can see, the pocket is slightly before on this side of the needle now. And I'm just going to lock this stitch in place. I'm doing my best to keep it in line. Pull your needles out right before you get to them. Sometimes when you sew over a needle, you can break your sewing needle because it'll hit that needle. So as we get closer, it's safe enough to pull out that needle. Now you notice too, I still have the tails, if you can see that, and that's from my basting stitch. Don't worry about it. We want them on the outside. We want them placed on the outside of our pocket so we can see where to pull all that stitching out when we're ready. All right, here we go. And you just gently work your way around the corner. And here's the difference. On not doing our curve first and then trying to sew it, it would be so hard to get a nice curve and have it stay in place while we're gently working our fabric around. I'm letting the machine do the pulling of the fabric through to sew, but I'm just maneuvering the circle a little bit with my hand. I'm just going to keep working around, trying to stay as close as possible to that edge. If you don't like the way the fabric's looking underneath, we're just going to stop, make sure our needle's in place, lay our press foot back down after we've lifted it up and adjusted, and we're just going to keep sewing. You see where I need to adjust a little bit? As long as my needle is in the fabric itself, I can lift up my presser foot and move my fabric around. Make sure you put your presser foot back down again before you start sewing. Pull out your needles as you go along. And pull this one out. This is our last one. We're going to go just beyond the pocket. I mean one stitch, half a stitch if you can, beyond the edge of this top piece of the pocket, and then we're going to go backwards. And we want to do that a couple times just to kind of give some strength to where the pocket and the underside, the blue material, meet. Okay, once again, we're going to cut our strings. Relax your thread to cut it. Okay, I trimmed, but now I want to trim this closer. Can you see where I have double stitched over this a couple of times going forwards and back, and how I just caught this blue fabric? So I stitched just barely beyond the yellow fabric on each side. That will help strengthen this area right here where it gets a lot of wear and tear from you putting your hands in and out. Whoops, covered it up, didn't I? All right, now I'm going to trim these little strings. After I've trimmed those, we're going to pull out what we did on the underside, that basting stitch. I left that string on the outside so I could get to it easily on both sides. All right, let me cut this and I'll show you the next step. Okay, here is our strings from our basting stitch that we did before we did all this sewing. And you can just start pulling it out. You're like, uh-oh, I'm wrecking things. No, you're not. It's just bunching up. Just pull one side and then the other. And just keep straightening out your fabric. You have a pocket. I'm going to put the other pocket on this side, and then we will make our next step with our pretty apron. And here you have both pockets sewn on. Make sure you press everything down, especially seams. You want to press them right when you make them. Next step is to do a stay stitch along the scallops of the apron. And that just kind of keeps those scallops nice and curved, and they won't straighten out on you or stretch out on you as you're sewing. We like to keep that nice and neat. Hopefully you can see what I'm doing. I'm just gingerly working my way around the scallops of the apron, and I've only got about 1/3 of an inch, even 1/4 of an inch is fine too. Just something to hold those scallop shapes together so they don't kind of stretch out. And you just work it gingerly, go very slow with your sewing machine. And I'm not distorting the fabric, I'm just kind of guiding it along. If I need to adjust, I just lift up my presser foot just a little bit so I can move my material around a little bit to get along those edges. Sometimes they want to move. Now make sure your needle's down when you're going to lift up your presser foot a little bit, and then you can adjust. So I'm just gingerly guiding my material in a curved pattern. Here's that top stitching I was talking about that I just did on my machine. You see how we have these scallops? That's going to hold those scallops into a nice shape as we put our bias material around it. So we're going to edge all that with this material. But that just helps this to not stretch out and lose its nice little scallop shape, because that would be a shame, wouldn't it? This piece is going to be a continuous bias, and it's going to wrap the edge of our little blue apron. The reason why I did not cut this out at the beginning of all my videos is because I wanted to show you how, excuse the camera, how pieces lay on your material. Remember I said how important it was to find the grain line? This says grain line, so we know we need to lay this pattern piece with this line parallel to the edge of our fabric, because this is our grain line. It runs along the edge of our fabric. You're like, boy, that looks pretty funny, doesn't it? If you would have laid it straight across or at a different angle, it just wouldn't look nice once you're done. It's very important that we do it this way. So no matter what it seems like, always lay your pattern piece the proper way, and it will turn out, trust me, even if it looks a little weird, because the whole pattern I know is laying across the fabric like this at an angle. It'll be fine. Alright, I'm going to cut that out, and we're going to apply that to our little blue apron. My piece has been cut out, and I can see that this line here and this line here tells me, it does tell me over here on the pattern, if you can see it, it says cut line. So I'm going to cut apart this whole piece that I just cut out. Okay, I've cut that big strip out into 3 equal size strips. And now I'm going to sew the ends together to make one long strip of fabric. Okay, here I have placed my 3 pieces of fabric together. I've pinned them together. And if you see there's a little notch here that you cut out when you cut out your pattern pieces, that's very important to have so you can match up your pieces of fabric together. If you notice with this type of bias, the tail ends are going to be hanging out past all your fabric. It looks a little strange, but trust me, you need to line up that notch so that when you do sew it across and you bend this fabric back, you will get a nice continuous piece of bias fabric. On this pattern, all seams are to be sewn at a 1/2 inch depth. Other patterns are 5/8. You check each pattern, it will give you how much the depth of your seam is. Alright, so I did a 1/2 inch depth from our raw edge inward, and I stitched across here. Now if you look, once I pull this fabric back, see it kind of gives you a continuous line. Okay, I have my continuous bias piece of fabric. See how that lays nice when you fold it all out? And I pressed all my seams in one direction. And I think it's just going to be easier to turn the material out. Now, if you have too much bulk, you could trim the bottom piece just a little more narrow, and the bottom piece being that this top lays over that, of course, you could just trim this just a little more narrow to take out some of the bulk. Make sure you don't trim the top piece, just trim the bottom piece. Now I cut that a little bit shorter. Now I have all my seams pressed out going in one direction. And we're going to use this. It's going to wrap around the edge of our fabric. These little tails, like I said, this little bit of a tail, if it's getting in your way, just trim a little bit off. I'm going to, because it's annoying me. There. We'll lay down a little bit flatter there. I just cut off a little bit of that tip right there. And we're going to fold this then. It's going to be folded and it's going to wrap around our scallops. Alright, I've taken the piece of bias fabric that we have, a nice long piece of fabric that we're going to wrap the edge of our apron in, and I've pressed out any seams, and I turned over one side of it, if you can see, maybe I'll show you right here, 3/8 of an inch. So when you turn it over one way, you will see a raw edge and then a nice turned over edge. And you'll see why we did that as we start to sew. Now on this bias tape, or bias fabric, we're going to wrap the edge of our apron. We're going to start on the back side because I think it's just going to be easier to maneuver. It's going to take a lot of pins and a lot of patience, but we're pinning the raw edges together, meaning if you look on the back or on the front, you will see the apron fabric, and then on the other side pinned to that is the bias tape. And I'm going to be sewing it on this way, and once we're done, then we're going to flip this over and wrap our edge. So as you can see, as I pinned this bias tape, as I pin this bias fabric to the curves of my apron, I just gently kind of worked it around the curves. You might have to stretch this just a hint. Don't stretch it too much, you'll stretch things out of shape. But cutting the fabric on a bias also allows you to be able to stretch a little bit some, whereas maybe just cutting it straight, there would be no give at all. So we need to kind of just work it and fit it around those scallops. Okay, for this seam, the pattern, the instructions specifically say to sew it at a 3/8 width hem. So you want to make sure you're not sewing more than that. So you want to make sure that the edge of your fabric, the raw edge, and your needle is no more than 3/8 inch. So your needle should be sewing 3/8 in from the raw edge. And just go slow. It's going to take a lot of needles, but a lot of pins rather, but that's okay. You can take them out as you go. follow your edge pretty consistently now. Be very careful about keeping your hands out of the sewing needle itself. Let me tell you, that hurts when you get stuck with that, and it is not a pretty sight. It's very painful. So we're going to do our best just to sew along. If you can see this outer edge, once we're done sewing that, we're going to be able to turn this over and flip it all the way over to the right side and sew down that side. And give us a nice edge. So I'm getting to the end, folks, and it's definitely taken a lot of pins. Keep those curves in place. But we are getting to the end. That's very important when you pin these two fabrics together, that you don't stretch the underneath fabric. You just want to take the bias fabric, and if you need to stretch a little bit to fit around the curve, you can, just a little bit, but do not stretch the underneath fabric, because we really want to keep those scallops. All right. Relax your thread rather before you cut, and that way it won't spring back and you won't lose your threaded needle. Okay. You notice I have a little tail up here that doesn't belong. Hopefully you can see that. Here's the tail. Sorry. Get you in camera angle. But we don't need that. That's just extra. I'm going to trim it off parallel with the underneath fabric. And we have lots of extra fabric right here. It's better to have too much than not enough. And you just won't know how much you need until you put it on. Okay, I'm going to trim that too. So that's a nice finished top. Nice finished top. Alright, now if we take material and turn it over, you get you a better camera angle. You can see it's been sewn. It looks funny, right? You're like, oh, right side to wrong side? Yes, because then we're going to trim this seam really close. Not so close that we're going to cut our seam, but we're going to trim, we're going to trim this fabric right here. We're going to trim it back some. Be very careful that you don't trim too much. Hopefully you can see me. I'm just going to trim, make this a little more narrow, this excess fabric, which now we don't need, because we want to be able to turn it over and make it look nice. You can take about half that fabric off, and that's from the raw edge. See, this is all the edge of your fabric right here. Can you see? We're just going to trim that down a little bit. Be very careful you don't cut the rest of your fabric. And we're just removing bulk. So when you turn over this seam binding, this bias tape rather, all this extra fabric, be hard to keep the curves nice and sharp. We don't want that. Right, I've sewn the bias tape right side to wrong side in this case. And I've trimmed my edge, my raw edge a little bit. See, I didn't trim off where I sewed, but I trimmed it to reduce the bulk. And then what I'm going to do is go to my iron and first press. I'm going to turn over like this so you can see it. I'm going to press my seam down like this. I want the right side of this apron fabric to fold down nice and neat over this fabric here. I want to press all of that. And once I've pressed this flat, then I'm going to take this fabric, bring it up over where I pressed, and press that and pin it into place. And then once I've done that, I will sew this side, and you will have a nice wrapped hem. And look at the contrast. Look, isn't that pretty? The contrast with this, but it goes together. Alright, I pressed this over, and you see where that raw edge is, where we sewed the two pieces of fabric together. This is what we're covering, and it gives us a really nice contrasting binding around our pretty little apron. So now I'm going to top stitch on top of this piece of fabric here. And there you go, folks. Doesn't that look nice and pretty? What a nice edge. Now on to the next part of our apron. So now we want to move on to the bottom apron. You can see here, it's a two-tiered apron, but we've already made the top portion. Now we want to make the bottom portion. And this is a much bigger apron, and of course it doesn't have the little scallops. So what I did is I cut my pattern piece out, my fabric. I cut the little notches. You can see those little notches there. It's very important to cut that out. Wherever they have a notch in your pattern, cut that out too in your fabric. Then I rolled over the raw edge of the fabric twice. Take it up no more than 5/8 of an inch in total. So basically I folded over half of that and then folded over again, pressed it, and I'm going to sew both sides. And then at the bottom I pressed with my hot iron. When I say pressed, I mean with the hot iron. I pressed under 1 inch of fabric from the raw edge, so 1 inch here. And once I've pressed that, then I took the raw edge and pressed a smaller little piece, like 1/4 of an inch, so that when I roll it over, my raw edge is totally hidden, and I will sew over that. That is going to be the hem of the apron. It's very important to also mark on the top of your apron, because we're going to gather it, the center. So I put a pin there. I'm using my little darts as the next position, so because it's even on both sides, and that's going to help me to gather it evenly. Alright, a sewing tip for you. Your sewing machine has little teeth that grabs your material, and that's what makes it go through the machine. It grabs the material and pulls it back as you stitch and sew. So when it does that, it ends up grabbing just a little bit of your bottom fabric more than your top. And it's very important to sew down one side of your apron and then sew up the next side. Why is that? Because it is grabbing a little bit more of your bottom piece, the bottom, and if you don't sew down one side and up the other, you could have a wonky piece of, you could have some wonky sewing. If you were to flip it over instead and then sew it up, it would grab a little bit more on the top of this. Well, we don't want to do that. We want to make sure if we're sewing it on the back side that those teeth grab up the same amount of fabric on the back side. Trust me, I know I'm not explaining it well. Trust me, it works. So, I have already pre-sewn one side of the apron. I turn it over, I press it down with my hot iron, and I have made a running stitch all the way down, a top stitch. You see the stitching from the top. That's a top stitch. I'm now going to go and stitch this side, making sure that since I have it face up to sew from this side, I'm going to have it face up when I sew on this side. Here's a close-up of the teeth that I'm talking about. This little bottom plate in here, you see those little teeth, that's what grabs the fabric as you're sewing and pulls your fabric on through. And these little teeth do eat up just a little tiny bit more of your fabric from the bottom than as opposed to the top. That's why you sew down one side and then sew up the other. And what I mean is always make sure if you're sewing with your wrong side fabric down on this side, you're going to want to make sure you turn around so you're sewing the other side wrong face down too. You'll see. I will kind of just run you through it real quick. See, I'm stitching with my wrong side of fabric down, stitching this whole seam. Alright, I finished that, and now I need to stitch the other side. The other side that hasn't been done yet. Now either you can gather up all your fabric and push it on through this way, which can get a little bulky, or you can turn your fabric around as long as you're doing wrong side down, because that's what I've chosen to do, wrong side down in the first place. I can turn my fabric around and I will be, in a sense, going up the other side. Always relax your thread before you cut it, and that way your thread doesn't bounce back and undo your threaded needle, which is a pain to rethread all the time. So I essentially sewed up the other side by using the fabric face down. It's whatever side you choose to sew your fabric on, whether it be face up or face down, you want to stay consistent on both sides. And I've already pre-pressed my hem in place so that I can just pin it real quick and then sew that as well. So once you have your hem pinned in place, all the way across, top stitch across that too. I am choosing to have my fabric right side up facing me and the wrong side down. Don't forget to lock your stitch in place. That means set it behind your fabric, just a little bit behind your needle, and you're just going to sew forward a couple stitches, and then you're going to reverse your machine and stitch back to the end. Now my fabric and my needle are lined up. I'm going to continue now forward, sewing my hem. It really does help to press your fabric first where you're going to want to hem it. It just helps keep it in place. I find I don't need as many pins to hold it if I've pre-pressed everything, which I kind of just want to stay in place. I do pin the beginning and the end in particular, though. I like to keep that just right. As you get to the end, come to almost off the fabric and go reverse it once and go forward again to bring the fabric all the way to the back. And that's locking your stitch. Locking your stitch in place. You want to lock that. That way it won't unravel or come out so quickly. Trim your ends, of course. You want to trim all that so you don't have little tails hanging out. You see how I've just stitched that hem. Okay, we got a nice hem. Our sides are hemmed and the bottom's hemmed. The top is a whole nother matter. Okay, here's a close-up of the top. You see the pin, that's the center of my fabric. If you were to fold the fabric in half, that would be the center mark. So I pinned it there. I have my little darts to help me. And my next step now will be to place my little apron, my little blue apron, on top of this fabric. You see how I marked the center of this fabric too, or this little apron? Now I know I can match it right up with the center of the back apron. Once you get that centered, just pull out your pins and then pin both of the aprons together at the top. See if you can see that. And continue to pin it all the way till you run out of places to pin it, which would be the side here of each. Now I'm pinning it evenly with the back fabric. Now that I have both of my apron pieces pinned together, I am going to just do a 1/4 inch. That's the width of my seam. So my seam allowance is going to be 1/4 inch. I'm just going to do a basting stitch across both those pieces from the edge, from this edge to this very edge right here. Just going to sew them together with a basting stitch. A basting stitch is the largest stitch that you can get on your machine. Instead of it is the largest stitch that you can get. Right now we're just doing that basting stitch to just hold these two pieces of apron together. And I'm doing about 1/4 inch. You don't need to lock this stitch in place. Ideally you would remove that stitching once you've got other stitches in place. Okay, Now you notice I have changed my seam allowance depending on where I have sewn on this apron. Instructions will tell you each step of the way what seam allowance they want for that particular step and what type of stitch they want you to do. So I have sewn those two pieces together with a basting stitch. It's a very loose stitch. And now I'm going to do a basting stitch across the whole piece. I'm going to do 2 of those. I find if you do just one line of basting stitch in order to gather fabric, the thread just isn't strong enough and it eventually breaks. You want to do 2 parallel lines. Now I'm going to take just a little bit deeper of a basting stitch, but I'm going to start, this one I'm going to try and start at the edge because it's just a basting stitch. It's something we're going to use to gather our fabric with. And I'm going to go in just a little bit deeper than my first basting stitch, but I'm going to baste the whole way across now. Include the top apron also. Basting stitches are not designed to be a final stitch. It's just really to help us either hold the fabric in place until we can get a nice solid stitch in there, something much shorter, or it helps us to gather the material. So it's not designed to hold your piece together in the long run. I sewed it all the way to the end. Now this is very important when you're doing a basting stitch. Make sure you have a long tail on both ends of your fabric. You want a long tail at the beginning of your fabric and end up with a long tail at the end of your fabric. It's very important to have that tail. I'm going to do one more of a basting stitch a little bit further in from the fabric now. Just a little bit. Parallel with that last stitch. Make sure you leave enough of that tail out. You're going to need it. And I'm going to sew right beside my first, I'm going to sew right beside that first stitch that I took, that first line of basting stitches that I did on the whole apron. Catch that top apron as well. Once again, leave a long tail when you get to the other side. Need that tail. Alright, now we're going to make sure everything matches up so we can gather this evenly and then add our waistband. Okay, so we have both aprons sewn together. We have to put our waistband in. This is what I like to do, again, because I like my gathers to be as even as possible. I want to find the center of my apron. I could have left that pin in the last time, but I did not. So, no big deal. I'll just fold it again in half, find out where my center is. I mean, you can even pinch it a little bit, and that kind of leaves a little crease in your fabric. And like, okay, there I can see it. There's my center of now my whole apron. I still have my little darts. helping me to match up. What we're going to do now, if you see, this is the waistband. The waistband I cut out, and I also cut out a piece of the interfacing. And it says to cut one interfacing and one piece of fabric, which I did. I then took my hot iron and I pressed the glue side of the interfacing down on the wrong side of the fabric. So see how stiff? It's really stiff. And that keeps your waistband in place. Make sure your waistband is nice and stiff and it holds up nicely. So I'm going to want to find the center of this waistband as well. And put a pin there. So I can see where that center is. It's about right there. If you see on this waistband, it also has notches. And those notches are going to line up with the notches here. But we also want to line up in the center. We're not ready to add this yet because, look, waistband looks short, doesn't it? Like, oh no, now what? Well, that's why we gather the material and then we're going to sew the waistband on. Alright, here's how you gather material. If you notice with my two tails, actually there's 4 tails. There's 2 on the bottom of your fabric and 2 on the top. I want to take the 2 on the top, you might have to look hard for them. You're going to separate the top tail on each stitch line with the bottom tail. Okay. We have the 2 top tails, if you can see. We're going to gently work our fabric, and be careful you don't pull hard. Just kind of, if it doesn't want to give, just keep working the fabric along your stitch line. Sometimes that fabric is hard to gather, but if you just be patient. I kind of wind it on my finger as we get going. Don't pull too hard. You'll break the thread if you pull too hard. This is going to take some work. See, if you get to a spot where it doesn't seem to want to gather very well, because I have quite a few layers over here, this is much harder to gather than, of course, the single layer here. You just keep working it across. Don't pull too hard. I just kind of take my thumbnail and gently work my fabric across. I'm just kind of raking my thumbnail across where I stitched. I need a little more, so I gather this up. This is much easier to gather right here, but we need this to be gathered as well. And I just take that thumbnail and just keep raking across. Hold it with my finger in the back, but raking my thumbnail across. And you just got to be patient. Do not pull hard on this. You're just kind of holding this in place. And as you use up this thread, I just kind of wind my finger close. And I'm slowly working this across. See how it's moving? So I'm slowly getting this across to the center. And I work from both sides. This would be hard to try and gather this fabric going all in one direction. So we're just going to work it as far as we need to on this side. Just keep raking your nail across the fabric in one direction, going towards the center. And it is slowly gathering, isn't it? You see, by now, if I'd only used one line of basting stitch, my thread would have broken a long time ago and I would have had to start over. That's why I use 2 parallel lines next to each other. Space out a little bit, you know. That way you can work that fabric across. See how we're getting this center piece. You see how we're getting the top blue apron also to gather with the bottom. See what's going into gathers? Isn't that pretty? I like to check and see where I'm at with my gathers. I know I'm going to have to match these notches and match the center. Let's see if I'm doing a good job. If I match it with the center and I find my notch, which sometimes it's hard to find once you're gathering all the material up. You could even put a little pin in there. There's my notch. I want that to lay right in through there. Oh, looks like I'm doing a really good job here. Alrighty. The gathers, you should end up where your gathered material is the same width this way as your top piece. You wouldn't want a big huge gap. Say this is a big gap in through here. Well, you know that you over gathered your material. You want it to lay nice and neat. Sometimes this helps me too. I'll just pin this right in place where I want it. I can pin my notch piece in place too, matching the notches. And then I can see I'm supposed to leave this waistband a 1/2 inch longer than my gathers. So I'm going to pin that so I don't go over that. Let me pin that in a 1/2 inch. Let's see. There's a reason for that, so don't despair. Alright. I know I don't want my gathered fabric to go any further than that blue pin. I'm going to just pin that too. Alright. Okay. Now look, see how it looks gappy right there? Well, we know that because this is gapping, we know that we can pull out some of these gathers to make it fit. Oh, now I got a gap up here, so I need to retighten it. Retighten my gathers. I'm going to pin that in place. Hopefully you can see what I'm doing. Okay, if you look at it, you see how everything just seems to lay nicely. Before you sew it, you're going to want to make sure that your gathers in here too are just even. But you pin it all in place. You kind of mess with the gathers a little bit with your nail. Like, oh, it seems a little less gathered here. I can chew up a little bit of this here. Kind of smooth out those gathers. I want a little more in through here. Just want to work with it all. We'll need lots of pins. Oops. Alright. So that's what the back side looks like. I'm going to now do the other side. How am I going to do that? Well, I'm going to pull from the other side because I left those tails, and that'll help me to gather from the other side. It's too hard to try and gather from one edge going all the way across when you're doing really thick fabric. You really need to pull from both ends and get both ends to look good. Sometimes this helps me too. Before I even start to gather, you can pin it at the darts, if that will help. And then you have to make sure you just gather that material up enough to fill in that gap. I've gathered the fabric onto the waistband, and I've left a 1/2 inch of the waistband free of gathers on both sides. And that's because we need to sew in our ties right here. Do not pull out your basting stitch yet. Work your gathers nice and neat with your fingers. You can just pin it as you go. If you need to repin it because you want to position it, the gathers a little bit better, just using your thumbnail, you can move them along. And so, whoop, this one needs a little bit better adjusting, I can see, so I've moved that, repin it. So now you see how we don't have any gaps. It all lines up, edge to edge, dart to dart, middle to middle. And we're going to adjust our stitch length back to the regular stitching length. Mine is 2.5. So I'm not going to use a basting stitch. Now I want to sew all this together. Once it's all sewed together, then we can pull out our basting stitch. I forgot to tell you that on this side of my waistband at the bottom, I did turn it over and press it 1/4 inch. Because once we wrap it over, that's going to be a nice smooth edge to stitch this. Ideally, make sure you do 1/4 inch on this side before you pin it, but you can do it after like I did, because I just happened to forget it, but it wasn't too late, thank goodness. Alright, I'm going to stitch along here 1/4 inch seam allowance. That means 1/4 inch from the selvage end to the needle, the sewing needle. And I'm going to use a regular stitch now, not my basting stitch. Do not take out your basting stitch yet. You will regret it. Alright, here we go. I started with my needle just a little forward of the end of my fabric, because I'm going to stitch it a couple stitches in place and go backwards. I want to lock that stitch in place and come back forward again now. You need to adjust. Sometimes it gets a little wonky. Pull out your needles as you go. This is going to be a slower process. I like to straighten out the fabric under it. I've made sure I've matched up all my darts. I like to just adjust the fabric underneath to make sure it's not getting all bunched up weird as I go along. Just go nice and easy, make sure this is all in place. Pull it all nice and neat. Go backwards to stay stitch. That stitch. That locks that stitch in place. Relax your thread and cut. So I have stitched my waistband and my aprons together. Do you see how they are all gathered? See all these basting stitches? Now we can pull all those out. If you left enough of your tails from your basting stitch, you can just start pulling them out. You may need to use your thread ripper at times too to get some of the thread out. But you just keep working at it till you get all that basting stitches, all those basting stitches out of your fabric. The nice thing about pulling out basting stitches is you can pull from both sides. I can pull the bottom strings, and they will break, and that's okay. We'll just keep pulling. Check on the other side. Maybe some of that thread loosened up and you can just grab it. It's okay, I've got a thread ripper. If your thread breaks while you're pulling it, not a problem. You just take your thread ripper and, whoops, I'm getting out of camera range, sorry again. You just work your way under each of these threads and just loosen it, or even break through on them. You can even, you know, if you want, just break it like that. Make sure you don't hit your final stitching line. That would be a shame. You don't want that. Okay, work at that till you get it all out. As you can see, I pulled out all of my basting stitches. They are not in here anymore. All gone. All right, our next step then is to apply our little ties that go in the back. So what I've taken is my ties and I have pressed them over on themselves. So I've pressed it right in the middle. It's made this tie. And I'm going to sew this from this tip over all the way down, down, and I'm going to leave this side open so I can turn my tie right side out. By the way, make sure you press all your seams as you go along. I'm just going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Start it on the fabric and work your way back. Go forward. Lock that stitch in place. I can turn my corner as long as I don't go below or over that 1/4 inch seam allowance along the tail here. Okay, if you see here, we've got this tip. And when we start to turn this fabric, and even this tip here, inside out, that's going to give us a lot of bulk inside there. And it won't turn out nicely and make a nice crisp corner. So I'm just going to snip across these corners here to help me get a nice clean edge when I flip my fabric around. Do not cut where you have sewn. You just slip off a little bit of that excess fabric. You see, I didn't cut. Hopefully you can see this. I didn't cut right here where the stitch line is. I just cut a little bit of excess off, and I'm going to do that right here. Hopefully you can see that. Now if you can see, I just took off some of the bulk here. Alright, now it's time to flip it inside out. Any type of implement, even a nice big fat screwdriver if need be. I'm going to take this end here, if you can see this end. I'm going to try and separate the fabric. Ew, it's kind of hard to do. If I can get a grip. Kind of separate the fabric from each other, both sides. You see how I've kind of pulled it apart? And I'm going to start tucking this end in. Just kind of, you have to work at it. That's what you got to do. Just kind of work tucking that end in, just to get it going. Don't worry what it looks like. You just want to kind of get it in there. Make sure if you're using your scissors, you do not open your scissors. And if they're sharp, just don't even use your scissors because you don't want to break through your fabric. I kind of have some dull tips, so I can do this a little bit. Of course, those might be famous last words. This takes a lot of patience. Push it in with my thumb. I use my pinking shears, they're really dull. So once you've got that end starting to go inside, you just kind of keep working the fabric. Take the outside of the fabric and just kind of pull it along. And you're working the fabric up your tool. That's not going to fare me too well. I'm going to have to go with something thinner. We'll try this. Just keep working the fabric. Turning it right side out. I know it's kind of getting all bunched up there, but that doesn't matter too much because as you keep working it inside, turning it over on itself. Just go slow. Take some patience. Whoop, you see the end poking out? Alright. I'm going to take this tool out and I'm just going to then keep pulling. And now I have turned my tie right side out. Looks a little wonky. That's okay. We're going to fix all that. We're going to get all this nice and sharp or nice crisp ends, and then we're going to press it flat. And we'll do that to the other one. If you're having a problem getting this last little tip out, you can, if you're ginger, just kind of take a pin and just gently kind of coax that seam and just keep working at it till you get all those little folds out. They do make little devices to help you turn out your stuff like this. I just am using my pin for today. Just going to coax it out as best I can. Okay, do you see why we took a lot of that bulk out? So we can get a nice pointy tip. Alright, here I've got my ties turned right side out. Look how nice they look. And now we're going to attach them to our apron. Make sure, this is the seam, make sure the seam is pointed down towards your apron. And we're just going to pin it right here at the bottom of where our waistband attaches to our apron. Alright, I have pinned the ties in place, the raw edge to the raw edge, and keeping it right along the bottom of where the waistband and the apron meet. And you don't want them pointing out, you want them pointing in for now. We're just going to stitch right here, stitch them in place on both sides. Sticks out from. So I'm going to stitch right along here. Okay, I wanted to show you how I sewed the raw sides together, and with the ties pointing in. Once we turn it around, we're going to pull the ties out. So both ties are sewed the same way. And this looks strange, I know. Keep them on the inside now, because we're going to sew it again. But we're going to fold this fabric over and sew this. We're going to sandwich this tie on the inside, just the raw edge. Make sure this tie stays out, that portion of the tie. And we're going to sew over all this again. Alright, here we go. Looks kind of funny, doesn't it? Don't worry, we're not going to sew across here yet. We're just going to do those end pieces. Okay, I stitch on both sides. You can see I stitch that together. Stitch that together. You can see my ties are still pointed towards the center. They're loose. Like that. I'm going to trim the bulk here. There's a lot of bulk here. So I'm going to trim it down, not to the stitch line, just halfway to the stitch line. And that's going to help me turn over this and make a nice finished corner. I also trimmed just a little bit of the edge. Don't worry, this is a previous stitch. This is my real stitch here. On both edges, on both tips. And now we're going to turn this right side out. See, we pull our little ties back, and look what we got. The ties are so nicely attached to your apron. All right, I'm going to show you. I just flipped it out. Tuck it out, pull that out a little bit. Okay, turn that right side out, got those corners nice and neat. And now we have the back side, which we can just pin to just below our stitching. Just below this stitching right here on the inside of our ruffles, and we're going to top stitch that. So as you can see, I top stitched all close to the edge, all the way around the waistband, catching the underside. So now you have a nice finished waistband. See how stiff it feels? That's going to hold up through a lot of washings and wearing. Right, here is our finished apron. Here's our little ties, and our underskirt, and our overskirt, and our little pockets. How cute is that? What little girl wouldn't love to wear that? Alright, stay tuned for part 6, where we're going to review some of the sewing techniques that we learned while sewing this apron. Alright.